So the idea of holding space is, how do we hold space to the richness of stories that are already there? Because that's the thing. There's stories who have been silenced and overlooked, but they're there, right? And we have learned how to silence ourselves, how to censor ourselves. We have learned how to show only the part that's acceptable to whomever. So how do we say, no, you can show up in the fullness of your story and we're not going to judge you, and do your thing and just be, that's what we need. So that's where the concept of holding space comes from.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Aminata Cairo as we take a communication perspective on holding space. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that all of us can learn something new by using that communication perspective, which will reveal new ways of seeing and being for us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Aminata Cairo. Aminata is an anthropologist, psychologist, educator, storyteller, and love worker. She's an independent consultant, a former lector of inclusive education at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, and the former lector of social justice and diversity in the arts at the Amsterdam University of the Arts. She is also the author of Holding Space, a storytelling approach to trampling diversity and inclusion. This conversation is the first in our series about showing up. So what is at the heart of these next 4 episodes is to ask, how are we showing up to each other? And this is such an important question to ask ourselves always, but especially when we're trying to use a communication perspective, because part of communication is how we show up to each other. Because when we talk about communication here, we aren't just referring to what is said as the communication. It's so much more than that. When you think about showing up as part of communication, you can think about what kind of attitude you bring to your interactions or relationships, what stories you tell and what stories you're guided by, what ways you respond to others, how you want to make others feel, and how you need to act in order to do so. There are a lot of different ways to talk about how we're showing up, and today with Aminata, we'll explore the idea of holding space as part of how we show up to each other, and what that really means for us, for our relationships, and for our larger organizations and cultures too. So let's begin the conversation with Aminata. Hi, Aminata. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, happy to be here. Good to see you too.
Happy to have you. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. And to start, best place to start, to introduce yourself. We'd love to get to know you a little more. And I know you've done many things and you have many stories, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that throughout this conversation. So don't worry about trying to get it all in just yet. But why don't you give us a place to start with getting to know you?
Okay, I usually always start with, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister. I'm a psychologist, anthropologist, a dancer, a former lector of inclusive education, and also the former lector now of social justice and diversity in the arts at the Amsterdam University in the Arts, and a Lyman T. Johnson scholar. So I usually start with that.
Yeah, that's a great start. I'm excited to dive in. Again, you've done so many things, and I'm curious about if there's a thread that you see through all of those things that connects them for you. But to start, I'd love to start with your book. I don't know if you just said that, but sure. Also an author, right? Holding
that's
space.
True. That's true.
So I just want to talk about holding space. Tell us about your book and what it means to hold space.
Yeah. So I was living in the US teaching anthropology, and then I went on sabbatical to the Netherlands and decided to stay there. And because of my background in anthropology, found a job in diversity policy at a university. And from there, roll into a lectorship, which is a research professorship in inclusive education at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. So I kind of rolled into that world of diversity and inclusion. And I noticed that the way I was doing it was quite different from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point came to me like, but you have to write about it, you know? So so that's what I did. That's how it started.
What was it? What was the differences in the way that you were going about things?
I saw diversity and inclusion is a lot about a few things. A lot of times it's about those people. It's about those people of color. It's about gender. It's about, sexuality or disability, about those people and how those people have been marginalized. And so my starting point is there's no those, it's only us, right? So that it was also a very intellectual approach, a lot of explaining and talking about stuff. But for me, it's a more fully embodied approach. And so the whole idea is about we have a certain way of relating to each other, which is full of inequities that have been historically shaped. And so the challenge is, how do we change those relationships, collectively? And we have to do that by being really honest and sometimes vulnerable and looking at what we have created and what we maintain with each other. We've created it, but now we're so conditioned that we maintain those relationships and that's the work. And so at times it might be uncomfortable. We have to confront these things, but we do have to disrupt them. And so that is what it is about. And it's always, again, about us, about how we relate to each other and how comfortable we've gotten, even though sometimes it might not be comfortable. This is what we used to, so this is how we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to kind of disrupt that collectively, and how do we do that, knowing that it's going to be sensitive, knowing that it's necessary. And so that was something I didn't encounter, in the standard approach.
Yeah. So how does holding space, your book, but also just the concept of holding space, kind of speak to that?
So the idea of holding space is, how do we hold space to the richness of stories that are already there? Because that's the thing. There's stories who have been silenced and overlooked, but they're there, right? And we have learned how to silence ourselves, how to censor ourselves. We have learned how to show only the part that's acceptable to whomever. So how do we say, no, you can show up in the fullness of your story and we're not going to judge you, and do your thing and just be, that's what we need. So that's where the concept of holding space comes from. And that is hard work. It's about the space that we create for each other, but it's also about the internal space. We are conditioned ourselves. Sometimes we don't even need other people to make us feel small or to make us feel less than,
Yeah.
because of,
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about that too.
Yeah. I think it's so fascinating to consider the way that we internalize stories, which is what I'm hearing you say a little bit there, to say, yes, maybe originally it came from outside stories telling us we are not enough, we are small. Yeah. But eventually, you start telling it yourself because you've internalized these stories and really the meaning within the stories. Yeah. And I know that that's something that you and I connect on, kind of looking at that stories as this way of making meaning. And then also to say that also means we can tell new stories and make new meaning. And that feels really important.
Yeah, you can change them. Yeah. The stories that we've bought into, the stories that we've been fed, the stories that are imprinted, like some stories are so deep, and so people talk about triggering. I don't necessarily use that language, but it's like, what story does this recall? What story, does this remind you of? What story is this linked to this older story of, when my mother used to do this to me as a child, and now the story that I'm living now reminds me, and maybe not consciously, but it evokes those emotions. And so, and then once you understand that, to start chipping away at the stories that we hold on to. And sometimes it's also a matter of getting permission. I was like, no, I can't let this, if I would let this go, my community might kick me out, because a lot of our stories are also tied to the people that we belong to. You belong to us because you know this story. Yeah. And you had better demonstrate, this story. But what if I want to, live a different story? Will you still love me? Will I still belong? And sometimes, the answer is no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I think about, telling new stories for ourselves or writing new stories for ourselves,
Yeah.
I think holding space is such an important part of the conversation that maybe people would miss at first.
Yeah.
Because if you think about telling a new story, you want to say, okay, well, that's coming from you. So just tell your story.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a previously untold story, but just tell it.
Yeah.
But you have to think about the context and the space that you're speaking your story into. And that's not always a welcoming space. And that's why so many stories remain as they are or remain untold. And so I think there is, it's worth looking at because there are real actions you can take to create a space where people feel safe, comfortable, excited, willing to tell their new stories or to kind of try out new ways of being or making sense of the world, which I think is a really vulnerable thing. So it makes sense that you'd want to create kind of a soft space around that.
Yeah. So that's where first you have to make it safe enough, and even that is complex because you hear a lot of people say, oh, I don't feel safe and therefore. So, okay, what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? A lot of times it means I'm uncomfortable. It does not necessarily mean that it's not safe.
Yeah.
But, I prefer to be comfortable at any and all times, and if I don't feel comfortable, then I'm out because I don't feel safe. Oh, and so in holding space, I talk about the Dutch word gezellig, and gezellig means comfortable. It's a very big part of the Dutch culture. Oh, it better be gezellig, keep it gezellig, and so the moment things feel uncomfortable, then we take that to me like, see, this gives me an excuse as an out because, it doesn't feel comfortable. Therefore, it must not be safe. No, it's just not comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll be all right. Sit in the discomfort for a second.
Yes.
The fact that you have to go through the discomfort maybe to get there, to build, to move forward. And that's where I bring in the blues. The blues is about, honey, I know it's hard. Bring it. Mm-hmm. Which is totally different. And the acknowledgement that if you want to get to this better place, you have to go look at it, feel it, suffer it, purge it, and then you will get to the better place. But where we have to be more honest and willing to go there, and allow people to share their pain or whatever, and not to stay in it, but to move through it.
Yeah.
And people only do that if they're not going to be judged. So part of that holding space, can you hold the space? Okay, do your thing. And I'm not going to judge it. I'm not going to say, oh, can't you make it a little bit nicer for us? I'd like to hear you, but can you change the tone? And what you're saying is, your pain is discomfort to me. It's not gezellig. It doesn't feel comfortable. So please make it a little bit nicer. And then I will be willing to listen to you. That's what we do.
Yeah. I'm so glad you say that. I think it is an important distinction to talk about safety because I think for some people, when they talk about feeling unsafe to share their stories, it is a literal question of like physical safety.
Yeah. Yeah.
But not always. And so we kind of use that as a general term when we could be more specific and, reach into the nuance a little bit more, which I think is important.
Yeah.
And so I'm reminded of a conversation I just had with Caitlin Metz. They're an artist, designer, author as well. And they talk about creating a soft space for people. And I kind of interchangeably use the word safe space when I was talking to them. And they kind of stopped me and were like, well, I'm very careful not to say safe space. I'm creating a soft space. And a lot of their work is about what they call collaborating with your emotions. Their book is called Feel Something, Make Something. So kind of drawing a connection between these feelings you're having, maybe very big feelings that you feel like you don't understand. And then when you can do something creative, putting a pencil to paper, you can make something from this place of your emotions, then that can be a really beautiful thing. So their work with this soft space is to say that you might actually they use, the word triggered in these moments. You might feel very activated is what they say too, which I think is a great way to put it. You might actually feel very activated. This soft space is not to say that there will be no discomfort here. And there's value in that. So it's not, I think you're making such a great point to say that, a lot of times we feel maybe an inch of discomfort and we go, ooh, oh, no, never mind. Okay, back away. I'm out. Can't deal with that at all. But I think it's so valuable to learn to sit in the discomfort. And that helps us because our world is very complex. And there's a lot of stories that exist right alongside each other that might feel, like opposites, like exact opposites. And yet they can all coexist. And that's a complexity. And that is hugely uncomfortable for so many people. But I think it takes some time to just, sit in it and maybe hold space for that complexity within yourself, within the world. And that's feels like such an important practice.
Yes, I agree. And I like that idea of soft space. I like that language, because safe can only be safe so far. At some point, you're going to take a risk.
Yeah.
I cannot guarantee you that your feelings will not be hurt, but can we agree that I will not maliciously try to hurt you? And that's the only guarantee I might be able to give you. Other than that, you're still going to take a risk, because you still might get your feelings hurt, but that these people are not out to hurt me. That's different. And, and is it safe enough for you to be brave? But there's always, there's no guarantee in the fact that there's always, you're going to take some risk. That's what it requires. But again, if we can be purposeful about in this space, let's agree that we will not try to hurt each other. That's a start. And then it's up to you if you choose to trust that, or, take a first step or whatever. But at least can we agree, certain things.
Yeah. That feels like a great demonstration of what I use being a communication perspective, which is to center, the communication. And that has a lot to do with the space, in between relationships between people. And so that would be, what I'd call meta communicating about communicating. I think people forget that they're allowed to do that, because you can go to someone and say, okay, I would love to share my story with you, but let's talk about how this is going to look, what I need from this moment, how I want you to show up to me, how I want to show up to you. And you can actually have those conversations. And a lot of people you kind of leave themselves guessing when they don't have to.
Yeah. I saw this group of people, it was online. I don't know if it's a conference or something about storytelling. And it was all about, this is how you do it. All these people are experts, and this is how you do it, and this kind of storytelling. And nor was it mentioned, but if I do tell my story, what will happen? What will happen? So it's not enough to go ahead and share my story. Yeah, but if I do get my story and it gets rejected or it gets minimized or whatever, I will hurt, I will leave, and I will never join again. So it felt a little like, like there was no context, like we were in a lab or something, like these stories no. There is a reason why I've held on to this story for so long. There's a reason why I've been silenced about this story, because I don't trust you. I don't trust this space, because I've been hurt before and all of that. So you cannot just talk about the technicalities of storytelling without talking about the space that they will take place in, So and what it will do to people, because if it's done well, because the goal also to create this better world, we have to interweave our stories. That's what will make us better. What will enrich us. That will help us validate each other's stories. If I only know my story and I never get to really feel your story, it's like, that's nice, but stay so removed. So the goal is to be able to share, but also to interweave our stories. But again, how do we do that in a sensitive way, and knowing that? And if we do it, you might feel some stuff. Will you stay in it with me? Yeah.
Yeah. The kind of visual coming up for me when you talk about the way that you were seeing these people talk about storytelling, it's kind of, like looking through a microscope. You're seeing such a small part of the whole picture, and you're missing so much when you zoom out. You're doing a disservice, I would say, to people and their stories, to not zoom out. And it's making me think that there's a model within the coordinated management and meaning theory that my whole communication perspective is derived from, and that's the serpentine model. And I know to talk about models, sometimes that feels so inaccessible to people, or just, like that's stuck in the academic theoretical realm of things, but I think it can be used very practically. And so the serpentine model is to, think of a snake weaving back and forth, and to say that it's about zooming out and seeing this bigger picture, seeing patterns, seeing our conversations in terms of turns. Okay, I told my story, and then this turn happened, as in someone responded X, Y, or Z way. And then that encouraged me, or, influenced me to respond in this way.
Yeah.
And even before the story, let's look at the turns that led to me believing that I could tell it or I could not tell it. And so I think that, it's so helpful to start to see the patterns that exist. okay, when people start acting like that, okay, when these are the messages that are being told, that is when I feel safe to tell my story. That is when I do not feel safe to tell my story. That is when I see other stories come to the surface. That's when I really don't see a lot of space being held for many different stories. And I think it's important, you seems like you're doing a lot of asking why. Okay, well, let's question some of the things we've taken for granted, some of the meaning we've taken for granted.
Yeah.
And so I think zooming out in that way, looking for the patterns and saying, how do we get here, is a great practice in that.
Yes, you have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also helps you not to take things so personally
Mm-hmm.
when you see the patterns. Is it me? It's like, no, actually, this is what we have been doing for a very, very long time.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're so conditioned that we don't even see. So when you're like, oh, so I'm just responding to, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For my own experience, I'm someone that I take things very personally. And so that's one of the things I'm working on to remind myself when someone is, maybe bringing me some fear, or, another feeling that I'm not wanting to internalize, trying to remind myself that's probably more about the other person and their own story more than, my own story.
Yeah.
But yeah,
99%.
99% of the time. Yeah. Once I start telling myself that, I'm like, oh yeah, for sure. I definitely believe that. But I spoke to my communication perspective a little bit. I know you use what you call a storytelling perspective.
Yes.
In my mind, I think there's probably huge overlap between that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So can you tell us what does a storytelling perspective look like?
Well, just like you said, the way we engage the world is through stories. The way we make sense out of the world is through stories. We create stories to make sense of things. Oh, this is how it works. Because if not, it would just be this incohesive data bank, but you make stories to make sense of things. And sometimes the stories are wrong, but it helps because it's a story. It gives you a certain leeway. It gives you a certain path. And so when I use that perspective, what I find is it helps me bring in people because everybody gets there like, oh yeah, I do see the world through stories. I engage the world through stories. Like the meaning making that so in the book, I had these big, theoretical concepts that it can be rather complex, but I wanted for people to get them, to understand them. And so I use stories. Okay, I have this concept. What story can I use that will give it? Oh, now I know what she's talking about.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of being able to use storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see you using stories as a means for connection.
Yeah.
Maybe, between people, but also it sounds like connecting ideas to people or getting ideas in people's hands, making them accessible.
Yeah, and sense making. And it's interesting when I meet some students who have seen me speak, when they come to me, oh, I remember you talking. And it's always a story that I told that I remember. They might not remember all the other stuff, but they remember the story. Oh, you went in this, oh, wow. That's what sticks. And so that's kind of nice.
Yeah, that's really neat. Do you have other moments of recognizing what kind of change you've seen in people's lives when they've learned to embrace a storytelling perspective or any of the other ideas that you speak about?
Well, I mean, when somebody shares that through doing this, they've changed their perspective on their own lives because now they, see their story differently. That's one of the most gratifying things. One person said was considering suicide, and then they read some of the stuff that I wrote, and then things shifted. So it's like, well, okay, I'm done. I'm done.
Wow.
That was the best, most wonderful compliment. And it was not even about a compliment, but it was about, because the compliment was like, oh, look how great I've done. It's not about that. It's about, look what this work can do. Look what we can contribute to other people's lives. And that's the gratitude. Yeah. That's the joy. Yeah.
that's the way that I see change really happening too, is like, yes, you could have an audience of tens of thousands of people. There's so many people that are connected and have big followings on, different social media platforms and speak to a lot of people. But also I think it happens one person at a time, because if I, show up to you in a certain way and you're able to reflect and say, wow, that meant a lot, the way that she's able to show up to me, that's what I want to offer to other people. You turn around and it just does, ripple out.
Yes, definitely. So I wrote the book. And again, so a lot of the stories I used were my own stories, because there might have been some good stories, but you have to be careful about putting people's lives out there, and embarrassing people. And there's one or two that I specifically asked permission for, but so I used a lot of my own stories to demonstrate. But I also didn't want people to just read the book to learn about my story. The goal was, I'm writing this and hopefully people will use this to go in conversation with each other. And that has been happening. And so that also makes me very happy when I hear like, oh, we started a book club and we're reading your book. And, it's like, yes, because it was, yes, I love for people to read it, but I would love for people that it will spark something, they can do something with it, that they can help them in some way. So initially I started on this follow-up book, like a workbook with like activities and things like that. I don't know, I might still finish that. But that kind of stopped. Just let the book gain some momentum first, let people read it and take it from there.
Yeah. I love that. And that's something that often comes up in my conversations, this kind of two-part process of, here first comes the language and the naming of things, which is so important. Yeah. And then what's the action that comes after that? Because you can't just stop with the words, I believe, even though I love the words and I could just stay there forever.
And also that words need time to land, and do something, whatever it is. So we don't always have to plan and program, but what comes up? Now that you've digested this, what comes up? And so again, I can make a plan about this, how you can use it, but maybe people come up with things, way better ways of doing things based on how they've been inspired by it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. And that takes me back to the whole theme of your book of holding space.
Yeah.
That, I'd kind of equate that to like holding time in a way, because, at least in the United States, I can speak to very much a go, go, go. We really, put people on a pedestal for like, oh, I'm so busy. Like people brag and be like, I'm so busy.
Yes.
But I would not brag about that. I like prefer when my life can slow down, because then I have space and time for, like you're saying, like different thought. That's when my best ideas happen, when I give myself space to, really sit with things. And it's like countercultural. It feels so revolutionary to talk about holding space, or kind of, I'm visualizing like, pushing things outwards and being like, no, I'm being protective of this space right here.
Yeah.
It's, not filled with activities or material things. It is space that I am holding because I see that there is value in the holding of this space.
And one of the things, I have a chapter on neutral space. And so, the visual that I use, like, think of like there's a wrestling mat, people in the middle of a wrestling mat and stuff is happening, you're on the edge. And rather than something happening, you immediately go there, that you allow some space, to not judge, to not immediately try to fix, because that's another thing. People say stuff and immediately, well, I don't care what you think. Just, no. The fact that you think you have to have an opinion in the, I don't know about the US, but in the Netherlands, they have, there's a word for it. I don't know if there's an English equivalent, but it's a culture. It's called polder. It came out of, in the Netherlands, it used to be a pillarized society. So you used to have the Catholics, you used to have Dutch Reformed. There was like 4 or 5 pillars. And so if you were Catholic, you went to Catholic school, you went to Catholic clubs, there's a Catholic TV station, Catholic. So you're really Catholic, everything. Dutch Reform, which is Protestant, you had that community. Then you had, I don't know, Social Democrats, some political. So you had like 4 or 5 pillars, and the whole country was organized along those pillars. So you would be in your community, all your social activity was with Catholics, the newspaper, everything.
Mm.
And so when there were times that they would get together, they would be very polite. They would be very polite, and then they go back and talk about each other, but yeah, so part of the culture is everybody has a say. Because we want to make it equal. We want to make sure everybody has a say. So part of Dutch culture still is somebody says something and immediately we feel everybody has to say something. No, sometimes you just need to shut up and be quiet. And you don't, but the thing that I have to have an opinion, everybody has to have an opinion. No, you don't, and to hold your opinion and not have judgment. So that's again, I've been in the US a long time, and this book also draws on both my Dutch and the US. But that whole idea of this neutral space, people can just be without you having to jump in, without you having to give commentary, they can just be. And so one of the things I give people as advice to use is to use, that's interesting. I've seen it, I've noted it, but no judgment. That's interesting. I've acknowledged it, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's a lot, and not like, that's crazy. Like, why would you? Interesting. And so even when people react to you a certain way, like, how can they? How could interesting choice. I don't have to do anything with that.
Yes.
Interesting that you choose next, so I don't have to take it into my spirit. I don't have to be offended. I just note it. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that whole idea of neutral space, and it also came out of when I started to learn about Buddhism. I had a hard time understanding the concept of detachment because I felt like detachment meant not caring. And It's not about not caring. It's about, I care very much about you over there, but I don't have to be in there, and that you can be very loving and caring, but be a little bit detached. And that's better for both of us. So that's where that came from. Not immediately feeling like you have to judge. And also, I need to give you room to do your thing. I also need to communicate, I have faith in you. Because if immediately, let me fix it for you, what is that communicating? That's also communicates like, you can't do this. Let me make you do it, whatever. But it's like, also trust that I'm here. And when you really need me, you'll call out and I'll be right here. But I have faith that you can figure this out by yourself, And if when you don't, give me a shout and I'll be right here. So even that, if we can communicate that, I have confidence in you. I believe in you. I think you are brilliant. You might not think right now, but I think it. So let's wait and, let's give your brilliance time to come to the surface, and I don't have to run right away to fix that for you. You are allowed your time to figure it out. You are allowed to struggle. You are allowed to not know. You don't have to have all the answers. So if we could do that for each other, how much more relaxed things would be. Because I think part of how we walk through this, oh my gosh, what will people think? Oh my gosh, I didn't do good enough. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. A lot of that is the world we have created, as opposed to, I'm doing my best. This is what I can do right now. I hope it's enough. And if not, but even that, a sense of rest, a sense of peace in that I am okay and my story is okay, even when I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, I feel like you're answering the question of if someone was wondering like, okay, well, how do I hold space? Like, what does that actually mean? I see a very tangible way of holding space being removing that judgment. And what you're describing, which I would call a difference between reacting and responding. Responding being, okay, stimuli or story, or, someone has said something to you, you can pause and reflect on what you actually want to convey, or what we talked about, that neutral space, like having a moment to kind of digest what has been said to you and how it makes you feel, and then responding instead of just, reacting. from a
And
place of maybe a
yes,
less thoughtful place.
and when you are treated like that, it does something to you. It gives you room to grow, because
Mm-hmm.
I think we underestimate how much we censor ourselves and how much, I share a story with you.
Please.
Yeah, I recently worked with somebody, worked on a team, and we did some things. And I know I have the tendency, and I have this with my children too. I see things quickly and things make a lot of sense. Oh, okay, this is it. Okay, come on, let's roll, And sometimes you leave people behind because they're like, huh, wait, what? And you're already there,
Yeah.
right? So I was working with this person. Okay, we're going to do this, and this. You got it? And they're like, yes. Now we're going to do this, and this. Yes. They said yes, but it was really no. It was really no. And then later that came out. I was like, oh. And then, but then it's painful because, maybe they were afraid to say something, but bottom line, they weren't honest. And again, but it also taught me like, oh, you need to not go so fast. And just because somebody says yes, does not mean it is yes. Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so then you get very careful, and because, and it gets, and I also know, again, like with my children too, I know I can, I get excited. Oh, excited. Oh, we can do this. We can do this. Come on, let's roll. And let's just do it. And people are, what,
Yep.
So this working with this person really like, okay, this taught me a lot. So now I work with somebody else. And again, some things came on the, and I started getting excited. Oh, we can do this, we can do that. Wait, stop. Sorry. Because I know that I have a tendency to go fast. Am I going too fast? And the person's like, no, do your thing. I know this is what you're good at.
Mm-hmm.
I trust you. Do your thing. And I was like, oh, wow. The joy, because when somebody gives you that room, no, you're fine. Do you,
Mm-hmm.
and that you can just do that without judgment. This is what you're good at. I trust you, and total freedom. And it's like, oh, wow, because, you are a professor, you are in the lead, you are a parent. So you're always responsible for, and I know, again, I can go very fast, but, but you start centering yourself. Am I going too fast? Am I leaving people behind? Da, da, da. And for somebody to say, no, do your thing. It's like this burden lifted,
Yeah.
It was very nice.
Yeah.
So again, so if we can do that for each other, hold the space,
Yeah. Yeah.
that you can really do you and do you fully,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
not take things personal and things like that. Yeah.
I'm thinking of my younger self and how I would react instead of respond in, what maybe seem like inconsequential moments, but enough over the lifetime makes it your pattern. I think about in high school, maybe people would make references to things that I didn't know about, but my assessment of the social situation was that I needed to know that thing in order to quote, fit in, be cool, whatever. Yeah. And so I say, yeah, I get that. I know what you're talking about. And that was like a reaction. Like it was like, I would say yes. And then after the fact say, I don't know what they're talking about, or I don't like that thing. Why did I just say that or I think of myself too, probably the biggest example actually is I like to know things. And I don't like to be new at things. That feels very vulnerable to me. Not to say I never, still put myself in that situation. It's one of those things where it's like, it's a discomfort. I'd like to lean into it, but I'm thinking about that someone, oh, well, do you know what that means? I go, oh yes, of course. Because again, I'm reading the social situation saying it would be better if I knew what that thing was. Mm-hmm. I'll Google it later. I'll just, get through this. Yeah. And so I think of all those moments of reacting, and I appreciate what you said a second ago of what does it do to you if you are always reacting? And what does it do to you when you are always being reacted to? Mm-hmm. And that feels like it creates a kind of social world or relationships that are not as authentic as they could be because there's not the space there for you to respond. And again, maybe I don't, want to use the word safety necessarily, but there's not the, softness of the space to feel like you can land there with vulnerability and say, for my, in my case, I actually don't know what that is. Could you explain that to me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with that reference. What is that?
Yeah.
And I like, the soft space feels right because it's like the space itself is soft, even though within that you might be feeling uncomfortable and prickly and challenged.
Yeah. And I know certain academic spaces, again, where we have these stories that your value is based on your status and your achievement, you don't dare say that you don't know.
Yeah. Yes.
Especially as a professor, where I expect, well, of course, you read all these books and you've done it, so you should know. I know a lot of things. That's a whole bunch of more stuff I don't know.
Yeah.
And I read this 10 years ago. Things I'm sure will have changed by now. But am I going to take the risk? Do I trust?
Right.
No? Because we have created this space where it means something to be an academic. It means something, that whole validation system. Yeah, will I take a risk? Will I take the risk? But and I don't think there are professors, who are doing things differently. Like, this is a learning space. We're learning together. If I'm guiding you, yes, I know a lot of stuff. There's also a lot of stuff I don't know.
Yeah.
And I need to be able to say that. But I know there are certain cultures where the teacher is God and knows everything. I've been in places like, in certain places in Africa or, I know in certain places in Asia, you don't question the teacher. And I also have seen teachers just say, excuse me, bullshit because they had to say something and they didn't know. But I cannot admit that I don't know. So they just make up something, as opposed to, what, let me get back to you on that later. Maybe I need to look it up. That's an option.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, that's a very cultural thing.
Right. And it's interesting to think about how part of the CMM theory is this idea that our stories shape us, but also we have the ability to shape our stories, i.e., tell new stories, rewrite stories, question, make meaning. And so it is interesting to think about maybe identity as a piece of that cycle of how are the stories we're told and the meaning that we make shape how we see ourselves and what our identities are. And then how do the identities that we cling to shape the stories we tell? That's what I'm seeing in the example you just gave, that maybe someone who is, for example, a professor or a leader in some capacity in a certain culture would respond and would tell, quote unquote, tell or live a story in a certain way because of how they see that identity, because the stories that are around that identity. And that, again, if we think about meaning being something that we make, and again, I think that is like a beautiful idea to say, wow, we make meaning and we can make new meaning that actually serves us better and leads us towards these better social worlds. That's very exciting and empowering, a challenge when you have to do that kind of first step of like, okay, we'll deconstruct and look at the previous meaning that's been made. And then what's the actual meaning you want to make? But I think that applies. Our identities and the ways that we interact with the world are all based in the meaning that we've made. So do we like the meaning that we've made, or do we want to make something different?
Yeah. And again, and also back to the whole embodiment. And when we are going to shift to that new meaning, you're going to feel something. And it might be uncomfortable and it might be scary. And because it reminds me when I taught international summer school, and half, if or not more of that, the first time I did it, half, if not more of the students were like from China. I had visited before, seen the class before I taught my own class. And I noticed the Chinese students, they do not open their mouths, they only speak when spoken to. So I saw that, like, okay. So the first thing I did, I removed the tables. So there's no barrier. So we sat in a circle, removed the tables. And then in the beginning, really talked about, this is how we're going to learn in this space. And to be very specific about, it will be different than what you're used to. And rather than like a lecture and then a discussion, we started with a discussion. Like we had two people that had to prepare to facilitate a discussion in the class. They had to come up with questions and people had to talk. And we talked about the fact that, and for some of you, this will be hard because you're just not used to it. So there was a lot of silence and sitting in silence and waiting. We'll wait. And then I had my Australian girl and the girl from Denmark. And then they would go, oh, let me wait. Because I know for me, it's easy. By the second week, my Chinese students were, I have a story to tell. Can I talk?
Mm.
It took a week, but they got there and they shared, they had never been in a class like that where, their opinion mattered, or they could, that's not how they were, these are the facts, give the facts back to me, and now, no, we wait to hear what you think.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw the transformation. I saw that it was possible and how freeing it was. And when they came, we want to share, it took a while and it took patience.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it also was that my Western children, they got it like,
Right.
let me not speak all the time. I know this is easy for me because this is how I've been trained. No,
Mm-hmm.
we'll sit and we wait, however long it takes, And the second time I taught the class, it's the same thing. I had more Americans. I had my Americans, and then Taiwan and China, and with one girl, and she would speak, and you would have to listen. It was soft, really, really soft, but she would speak, and so we're gonna even don't dismiss, don't dismiss. They might not talk in the way that you're used to. She was talking, and it took her a little bit of effort and took patience on our side, but we'll wait.
Yeah.
Because she has something to say, and what you have to say matters.
Yeah.
So that was a beautiful experience.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I'm thinking now about how you can hold space on a number of levels. Because when you first started talking, I was kind of thinking about something that I am working on, I would say, is actually holding more space like for myself. So I've kind of, I talked about being like a people pleaser, I guess is kind of the best, most understood words I could put to it. To say that I am someone that maybe shrinks myself down to allow other people to have more space in a kind of, I want to keep the peace way, or in a, I just feel more comfortable, or I assume other people will feel more comfortable if I just, express less opinions and just agree with everybody. But I'd love to not be like that. And I'd love to, I don't want to encroach on other people's space too, because I want them to take up their space exactly as well. But I think there's room. I'm trying to learn at least and start to believe that there's room for me to hold space for myself. And then also you can be holding space in, your interpersonal relationships, maybe one-on-one. You can hold space in the classroom and, large groups of people. And what you're talking about, almost holding space for, not just different individuals, not just different stories, but for different cultures, feels like, kind of a higher level of that, not necessarily better or more important, but just bigger.
Yeah.
And it takes me back to this language of, really embracing dialogue, or what, we'd call in a communication perspective, cosmopolitan communication, which is, specifically different than other forms of communication that are maybe more like us versus them. A cosmopolitan communication or a dialogue would be about, existing in this tension, or what we could say holding space for other people's ways of being and thinking. And at the same time, standing firmly, being profoundly open to this, and also holding our own ground, holding space for something, and holding our own space as well. And I think that's so beautiful. And your story is important because, kind of checking my own self, I know that it could be really easy for me when you say, oh, well, in these other cultures, the professor is the end of the line. You do not question that person. I could be kind of like, well, that's not my ideal situation. I want a world where, you can kind of question. And again, we're all just making meaning together, and people aren't put in roles where they're forced to react instead of maybe having the space to respond. But that's not it either. What I love about your story is this kind of like meeting in the middle, when you hold the space for everybody to be exactly as they are, and also make them a little uncomfortable and kind of stretch the meaning that can be made in the stories that can be told. Then you're able to, bring these two groups that their stories and their ways of being maybe looked like exact opposites.
Yeah.
You still bring them together when you create the space for that.
Yeah. And that's, if you're purposeful about that, it can be done. Because be very purposeful about that. And again, and to always mention, and when we do this, it might be uncomfortable, but I need you to hang in there with me anyway.
I think that even just saying this might be uncomfortable, and then doing the maybe uncomfortable thing, I think makes it such a different experience than not acknowledging that. And then just doing it, because I think people can, again, have the stories of like, whoa, I'm uncomfortable right now, but nobody's acknowledged that this should be uncomfortable. So is something wrong with me?
Right. Yes,
That those kind of
exactly.
stories like snowball and build on
Yes.
each other.
Yes.
So if you can name things and say, this might be uncomfortable, and yet here we go, that's not
Yeah.
stopping us. Yeah, that feels like that itself opens up a whole new avenue of stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I've just been asked to give a presentation on the imposter syndrome, which I don't believe is a real thing.
Yeah.
But again, because it's a lot based on anxiety and things like that. And
Mhm.
what message does the anxiety give, and where does that come from? What is the story? And what's the story you're stepping into? What's the story that you're bringing that evokes anxiety? But also because of my background as a clinical psychologist, I have issue with calling it a syndrome,
Sure.
because we love diagnoses.
Mhm.
And oh my gosh, I have a syndrome. No, you don't. You're stepping into a story, an existing story, where you might not fit, and you bring, it's this clash of stories. And once you understand that, okay,
Mhm.
if this clash of stories, but also then this emotional response, which can affirm, see, I'm sweating, see, I'm nervous. This much mean this only confirms that I have this syndrome, and it's like, no, you're just uncomfortable. It's all right.
Yeah. I think that's important too, that, and we've had a previous conversation to say that naming things can
Yeah.
be so important, and also can kind of keep you stuck,
Yeah.
if you're not continuing to,
Yeah.
look at the meaning, ask why question, things like that.
Yeah.
And so to me, when I think about, okay, if imposter syndrome maybe is not the most accurate way to describe what's going on, I want to ask, like, okay, well, what is the truth at the core of that? That makes so many people resonate with that or cling to that,
Yes.
quote, diagnosis, and I see it as being this whole conversation we've been talking about, this, like, I have this deep-seated discomfort with being in X, Y, or Z situation.
Yes.
And when you call it an imposter syndrome, it's like, okay, there's something wrong with me and the way I'm showing up, where I think the reality is that, no, the stories that you have been told and the context you exist in is what make you feel that you don't belong here.
Yes.
I'd put that, maybe in the umbrella of like representation matters. If you've never seen a story, you've never been told a story, you've never seen anyone that, for example, looked like you in X, Y, or Z role.
Right.
Then you're showing up with imposter syndrome, and that's not anything inside of you,
Right. Yeah. But again, also that whole concept of story helps with that. The fact that you might feel like you don't belong, and that might have been the story, that people like you were never welcome here.
Right.
That's a very real part of the story. And so there might be remnants of that you will encounter. But just know, it's just a story,
Mm-hmm.
And you're here now. So, regardless of what story is out there, you're here now. But that's very real. And so the discomfort, so that the discomfort is then normal. It's normal as opposed to a syndrome or, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's given that there's this clash of these stories, a story that says you're invited and you're here to show what you can do. And this story like, oh, but people like you have never been here. People like you tend to underperform. You don't know people like you. That's then a clash. And so that clash will evoke some feelings, which is totally normal. And then how do you negotiate those stories? Are you going to buy into it? Or you can say, well, that's cute. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting that you think that way about people who look like me. Very interesting. Now move aside. Let me do my thing. And I've had to do that myself.
I believe it.
Knowing that, because I can spend a whole bunch of energy into wanting you to change how you look at me. That's wherever you got that story from. More power to you. Get a step aside, and hopefully that, because I don't have time to wait.
Yeah.
I've worked hard enough to be here. That should be enough. You might have doubts. Work that out. Get some therapy, whatever it is you need to do. Get to know me. Get to know some other people who look like me. That's the work that you have to do. That's not on me. I have to do my work, and I have to do it well. And it's easier said than done. But again, that's about holding space for me, and as I enter these spaces where, I might not necessarily fit.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of wrap up our conversation here, I want to mention something that you said in previous conversation we had of considering identity and its relationship to stories, that you said what, is at the heart of your thinking is that our identity
Hmm.
is human beings and
Yes.
everything else is just
It's a
stories.
story.
And a
Yes.
thing I want to say to that is that when, we're kind of giving this, oh, it's just stories, just change the meaning, just, step aside, move on, forget that. It's not to say that the stories that we have internalized in here are not very real and
Mhm.
make us feel very real things and think very real things. It's not to discredit that, but it is to say that it is just one of many stories, right? And we
Yes.
can choose new stories, and that again is hard work. But yeah, I just want to hear you speak to that a little more. That what do you
Sure.
hope people hear when you say something like, our identity is human beings and everything else is just a story?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm at the point now, like I said, you have a heartbeat, you have breath. That's it. Everything else is a story. What it means to be white, what it means to be black, what it means
Hmm.
to be a woman, depending on the time, the space, the community, that story changes and can be so broad. Um, and I hope, my goal is for people to start seeing it that way, and some of these stories we've been fed from the cradle or from our ancestors,
Yeah.
our religion. And so they become our truth, but it's still in the end still a story. And you can still let it go if you want, if you need. It's malleable. Um, and just to start recognizing that, and which also comes back to not taking things so personal. Like, how dare you mess with my story?
Yeah. Right.
And that I feel so disjointed with my story is all of a sudden changed. But it's just a story. So, as a woman, I mean, there's certain cultures as a woman, it means like, I know there are cultures, if you don't have a baby, you're not really a woman. You'll always be seen as a child. Well, and if you're infertile in that culture, well, that sucks. You know, and you get treated a certain way. And so that might affirm like, see, I'm not fully a woman or whatever that means. But it's still just a story,
Hmm.
which served a purpose. And maybe it served a purpose 100 years ago, when we had a low population. But in this day and age,
Yeah.
and
Right.
these stories, they serve a purpose for you to be in your place so that we all know what we have to do, so that we know who the outsiders are. And I get that. And still, I can change my story. And still I can, and not just change, but expand my story. Yes, I can be this, but I can also be this and this and this and this and this. One last story. Um, there was a show a number of years ago about, I think they were Mennonites. So they're kind of like Amish, but Amish light, like they can
Sure.
have
Yes.
yeah, because they can do tractors and there's certain equipment that they can have. But male and female role are very clear, and so you go to school until like 8th grade. And so there's one woman, young woman, she wanted to go to college. And it's like, you're a woman, sorry. And there was other things she wanted to do. And so then the men took her, oh, you want to be, you want to go step outside of your role? Okay. So she had to stick her hand up a cow's butt and all this just to prove that, you want to hang with the men, you want to do men stuff. Well, come on and do this. It's like,
Wow.
wow. And there was nothing wrong with wanting to, at least for me, but to be in a community like that where what it means to be a woman is very defined. And if you step just a little bit out of
Hmm.
it, you get punished for that.
Yeah.
And I think it was her mother loved cooking. Her mother, like her mother loved cooking for the community. That was her mother's joy. The father had committed suicide. And because of that, the boys were going to school. And, again, they were only supposed to go to 7th grade. And the mother allowed them to stay in school longer.
Mm.
And they were playing football because, they've lost their father in a horrible way. Let them do that. And so they punished her.
Mm.
And so she couldn't cook for the community anymore. And she had to sit and eat by herself.
Wow.
And it was just like, I mean, it was hard, because her role as a woman was to be fulfilled in
Hmm.
cooking for people. But because your children, because, and that's how she was punished. And it was, of course, her daughter was like, I want to do stuff that, so the poor woman,
Yeah.
trying to accommodate her children, but
Right.
in a community like that, but talk about the stories that shape our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what if I'm a girl and I like being a girl, but I also like to do, and there was no room for the also,
Yeah.
you know? And again, as a community that might have assured our survival at some point, but in this day and age,
Mm-hmm.
different circumstances, different contexts, different needs,
Yeah.
and that strikes fear in people,
Mm-hmm.
So we hold on for dear life. No, 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 no. If we do, then we lose. There goes the neighborhood, right? There goes the neighborhood. There's the quality of the community. There goes our tradition,
Yeah.
whatever. And so, and I come from and I don't know, I might be rambling. I come from a culture with a lot of traditions, and it's beautiful. But sometimes when you hold on to stuff for dear life,
Yeah.
it can also be damaging and limit the potential of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and ultimately with holding space, it's about how do we create spaces that are compassionate and caring so that we can be the best who we, that we can be, and a lot of times out of our survival, our stories have become this I understand. So let's hold on to this,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about another model from CMM called the hierarchy model. And the hierarchy model is about acknowledging that there are many, many layers of context that affect us. And perhaps there is even a hierarchy within that, or a heterarchy is probably the more accurate word because they shift.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say, the story you just told, that the people in that community, their highest level of context, the story that they are, telling the most, that is the highest, the one that has influenced them the most, is these are our traditions and these really matter.
Yeah.
And again, there's room for all of these contexts that are affecting us, because it is also valid for a mother to say, this is what I want for my children. And this is the choice I'm making around these values that I have. And so I think, again, if you can recognize, that gives you so much insight. I think if you can recognize what story you are speaking from, or what story you are kind of under the influence of in your actions, to consider that like motivation almost. Yeah, that was just what you were saying that made me think of, but I appreciate you sharing that story. I think that, is a great way to kind of explain what we're talking about. Is there any final things you want to share, Aminata? I know we've covered so much, so no pressure. If not, I like to give the space at the end just to say, what did we miss? What do you want to share? What do you want to leave people with?
To be compassionate, to move out of compassion, especially in this world that has become so polarized.
Yeah.
We're so entitled to our anger. We're so entitled to our story. And then because of this story, we feel entitled to be hurtful to other people. But when you start from compassion and to not, and then also, and to not be threatened by other people's stories, and a little bit more often say, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And to just leave it at that. You don't have to do anything with it. You don't have to judge it. You don't have to condemn it. That's interesting. Beautiful. Do your thing, Yeah.
Yeah.
And hope at some point we can interweave. But that's my dream.
Great. Okay. The tool people are taking from this is to put, that's interesting in their back pocket and whip that out when they need to. I like it.
Yes.
I like it.
Yes.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Aminata. I'm so grateful for our conversation today.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Aminata, but still just the start of this series on showing up. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which act as a next turn so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the two questions I would have you think about are, how are you showing up? And where can you learn to hold space? You're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections on those questions, whether it's the day you listen to this episode, a week later, a month later, a year later. The invitation is always there. And you can connect with me through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all the places to connect with me are in the show notes. Also in the show notes are some links to connect you to the initiatives of the CMM Institute. I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, and this podcast is just one of many initiatives that are all designed to move us toward those better social worlds by taking a communication perspective. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and those other initiatives in the links that I've provided in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.